Welcome back to Warner Economics on YouTube. I would like to share my latest Substack. I wrote it up and published it just recently. And there's a bit of a story there. In June, everyone was talking about the petrodollar agreement ending. And then we had the fact checkers debunking this. And so it seemed to be worthwhile to look into what really happened on the 8th of June, 1974, and how this fit into the picture. So here we go. Let's go into Werner Economics on Substack, which is rwerner.substack.com. If you go to Substack, you'll see that there is a paywall, I'm afraid. I do request that you subscribe in order to support my work. I have been doing a lot of work for the use of the general public, actually for quite a few decades. And it would be good to have some support from you to be able to continue this work, as of course resistance is strong and interference exists. But this way, you can help me to continue my independent research and work. So here's the Substack. And these are the recent posts. So I had one of the opening posts in April on the gold price surge, why this is an important signal and why it does mean that the end game has begun. Have a look. Then I wrote one on the yen collapse and why the Japanese yen, which was at a record weak point already, 34-year weakest yen, why this actually was going to continue. Many people are saying, well, it's so weak, and it clearly is excessive yen weakness. But so many people were saying, well, okay, you can buy the yen, but I was warning and have been warning, well, it will likely weaken further, and that's just what we've had as I speak. Now it's a 38-year low of the Japanese yen. And so you see the story here. It's really the battle between the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan. We had this before in the 1990s, where the FX intervention, which is ordered by the Ministry of Finance, is totally sabotaged, in fact, over-sterilized by the Japanese central bank to get the opposite result. And that is because the Federal Reserve tells the Bank of Japan to keep the yen weak because that makes the dollar strong. And that actually is a good entry to the petrodollar story, because that already happened in the 1970s. But before we come to that, just briefly, this year I met at the Bank of England, the Bank of England chief economist, and that's also written up here to get a bit of a glimpse of how their chief economist sees this, and a bit of reflection from me on that. And then, of course, we've had the rout in the French bond market, which has caused several commentators to say that, oh, France is going to have a Liz Truss moment. Well, what is that? What is a Liz Truss moment? Well, she was prime minister very briefly. She's the prime minister with the shortest period of office term in history in England. And why was that? Well, the media, very much influenced by the central bank, was saying things like, oh, she's just stupid policies, and it's all her fault. Well, actually, I show in this article that the Bank of England created a bond market crash in order to make her look bad. And of course, central banks have the power to do that. And sadly, they do topple government. So have a look. And then we have the end of the petrodollar, which is what this brief video is about. And I'll keep it brief. So among these recent stories, so we go to the end of the petrodollar story. When you subscribe to the Substack, you get full access to these stories. Here it is, the true story, because, well, just like in 2020, when there was the official narrative, and then there were some dissenting opinions, and then were fact checkers coming out. That's the same thing we've had also actually concerning the petrodollar story in June this year. So what's going on? Well, it really started with the reports coming out around the 8th, 9th of June this year, 2024. And they were pointing out that, oh, hang on the 9th of June, that's the day after the 50-year agreement with Saudi Arabia has ended. That was one spin we heard there. And they referred to the petrodollar agreement. Now, clearly, the date is important because it's a half-century anniversary of something that happened in June 74. But what exactly happened? And is it really over? Something new may be happening, but perhaps there's still actually some misunderstandings about that. So I went back and did some research on this. And of course, many of you will have seen my The Conversation story of March last year, which really anticipated quite a bit of that discussion. It was also published in Fortune in March 2023. So if you put my name and either The Conversation or Fortune in there, and I think in the title there was also quantitative easing and central banks, you should be able to get it. Otherwise, you'll find it also, I think, linked in some of my websites, richardwerner.org or professorwerner.org, or send me an email or drop some comments. Now, what really happened? The debunker said, oh, this is a conspiracy theory. There's no such thing as a petrodollar agreement, and nothing special happens on the 9th of June. But quite strangely, actually, on the 9th of June, Reuters put out a story, oh, America is about to make an agreement with Saudi Arabia, which clearly was launched because so many people were searching for something, and then they had something that could be spun in the way Reuters wanted. We did have a bit of a debunking headline here. The US dollar will continue to be used for oil sales, contrary to false online claims. That's a standard technique for the fact checkers to set up a straw man. You claim they said something which nobody actually claims. I mean, nobody has said that it will not be possible anymore to buy Saudi Arabian oil for US dollars. Nobody said that. The whole point was, and as I explained already March last year, that America managed to get Saudi Arabia to sell its oil only against US dollars. Okay. And that did happen. And the second part of the deal was that because then billions of dollars would come into Saudi Arabia, America made sure that Saudi Arabia would reinvest 80% of that into the US. Now, it emerged in recent years that actually that was a secret agreement. The 80% that only was actually first published by John Perkins in his very good book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And later, Bloomberg did a Freedom of Information request, and it was confirmed. While the data of US Treasury holdings and the enormous extent they were in the hands of Saudi Arabia were actually hidden for decades by the data never being split up to show only Saudi Arabia. It was part of many Gulf states. And that's how they hid this. So it was actually kept secret. And what else happened was, of course, there was a formal agreement, and that was actually signed on the 8th of June, 1974. But just briefly, so the background was, of course, that in August 1971, President Nixon defaulted on US obligations to change the US dollar into gold. And the background to that was that in the 1960s, in particular, the US was just creating lots of dollars, and the rest of the world mostly had to stay quiet, but some countries, particularly France, which was not part of NATO, was not part of the strategic command hierarchy, in other words, wasn't be easily bossed about by the US, didn't have US troops in the country. France said, well, hang on, they're just printing dollars and buying the world, buying France, buying land companies, everything, printing dollars. Well, stop it. Well, they didn't stop. So the French said, well, hang on, we're allowed, according to the Bretton Woods agreement, the monetary system put in place after the Second World War, agreed in 1944, we're allowed to change all these dollars that you're giving us. I mean, they were mostly not cash, obviously, they were bank credit. Still, we're going to change those into gold. Oh. And they did this, and they sent actually Navy ships, battleships to Manhattan in peace. The crew had the job to disembark and with some equipment, I guess, transport equipment, go to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and get the French gold out. Because initially the Fed was, of course, saying, oh, you can change it all into gold if you want. We'll hold it in custody for you. And the French said, well, hang on, that's not quite our idea. We actually want to have the gold. And so once that started, the Americans knew, okay, well, we better default. Of course, they didn't put in those terms. So they called this Nixon called it protecting the US dollars against speculators by temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold, which of course has been in place for more than half a century, this temporary suspension. And then the dollar fell. And so how do you make sure the dollar doesn't fall and fall and fall, which would have been a disaster for America because it needed the purchasing power to continue to actually have, over 1,000 military bases across the globe and spend and get people to accept its printed dollars as money, and continue to get resources from the whole world to support its empire and military. And so they came up with a plan. So the plan was that Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and made this deal. And the deal was, of course, a bit of a protection racket, because the Americans said, well, we'll protect you. We'll make sure that the ruling dynasty, the House of Saud, will stay in power. We'll make sure, there's all sorts of wars, but we'll make sure it'll be peaceful, you'll be safe, we'll protect you. There has to be some give and take. Of course, you've got to do something for us as well. And that's going to be, well, you see, we'll make you rich. We'll make you very rich. Because, you see, we're going to hike the oil price. You're going to hike the oil price and we're going to back you. It's going to go up multiple. So you thought you're earning billions. Well, we're going to quadruple the oil price. This is January 74. And you get 4 times as much. Now, you will only sell the oil against US dollars. So you get a lot of US dollars. That's great. That's the world currency. Once you like US dollars, because you can go shopping with that because it's the world currency, you see, a circular argument. and of course, you have to help us by, what's the safest place to keep most of your dollars? You see, 80% you will invest in US treasuries. And that's very nice because we pay coupons and the amounts are so huge. You don't need to touch the capital, the principal. You can live luxuriously on these huge dividends that we're going to pay from these vast amounts of money. Isn't that a great deal? And we'll keep protecting you. And that way they solved the double problem they had, the world record current account deficit, i.e. they needed to borrow from abroad, they needed foreign money to come in, money from abroad to come in. And secondly, world record government fiscal deficit. Because with the Saudis buying the US treasuries, you had the money coming in from abroad and funding the deficit, the bonds that were being issued to plug the huge and still growing budget hole and compounding national debt, which is now, of course, in record amounts, 34 trillion. So that was the deal. And Saudi Arabia, well, what did they do? You see, initially, the US made some promises and Kissinger made some promises, and was essentially saying, yeah, we know you also want something. You want some things, and you're talking about, there's this conflict in the Middle East, and you want some things to happen, some countries to go back to their previous borders of 1967, Israel. Well, we understand, and it's complicated. We'll help you. We'll help you. And yes, interestingly, so I found that Saudi Arabia didn't want to raise the oil price because it's always, presented as if it was their idea. It was actually a US idea because that's how you really support the dollar. and get more money coming in, a multiple. If you do this racket, might as well then get a multiple by vastly jacking up the oil price. And you can transfer more money from Germany and Japan and other countries to the US this way via Saudi Arabia. And that's what happened. And the Saudis were actually saying in their own record, when you look at the now disclosed sort of minutes and letters of exchanges, and you see that they kept saying from, sort of middle 70s, 1973, 74, we want to, actually, this is temporary, and we think, the oil price has to be lowered again. The Americans didn't like that. But of course, they were very diplomatic initially. So the Saudis played ball. But as soon as that agreement of 8th of June, 1974 was signed, that put in place, and this is really what I found there, that put in place the administration to run Saudi Arabia by the US. It put several so-called joint commissions in place, the United States Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, and of course had the Military Security Commission, which was entirely in the hands of the US. And they put several hundred administrators into leading positions in Saudi Arabia. In fact, they were literally running the show. We know this, for example, from a letter written by Joseph Sisko, was the top administrator for the US among the administrators they put in. And this letter was written to Henry Kissinger, in which he says, well, okay, now we've got these two commissions, one on economic and one on securities matters in place. And they will operate, quote, subject to that's his, Sisko's, day-to-day political guidance and coordination under your direction, Henry Kissinger. That's how the show was run. Kissinger had the goal to increase oil supply. That was achieved by March 74. And promising Saudi Arabia solutions and compromises, which actually never happened. But Saudi Arabia played ball. So the restrictions on oil supplies were relieved, and so the oil price could have come down, but it didn't, because it was kept high and actually continued to rise against the wishes of the Saudis. So Kissinger achieved the goals here, hike the oil price while increasing the volume, so you get the money rolling in. Secondly, gain total control over the Saudi economy and government to ensure compliance with US objectives. Thirdly, make sure the Saudi currency stays pegged to the US dollar. That is another way to make sure the Saudis can't easily escape. And the Saudis would therefore have an incentive to sell the oil only against US dollars. And that is still in place. Saudi currency is still pegged to the US dollar, so keep that in mind. And then the steady rise in the oil price, which actually continued then through the decade. And fifthly, another concern was for Kissinger that this whole thing with Middle East tension and Israel Palestinians and so on, that this would be kept away from the discussions about oil and the oil price. And so these 5 objectives, he got 4 out of 5. And one had to conclude that the Bedouins would have to follow orders, as Kissinger commented with this reference in one of his communications. But the Saudis didn't quite play ball. They kept saying, actually, we want to lower the oil price. We're thinking of the world. They're on the record, their foreign minister, Al-Sakaf, saying, this is quite bad, particularly for poorer countries. And, we don't want to rip off the world. This is too expensive. The Americans didn't like it. Now, this is very little known. And secondly, they kept saying Israel should withdraw to behind the 1967 borders, as the various UN resolutions also were saying. Now, Kissinger put out several warnings that it's dangerous for Saudi Arabia to be at the forefront of these issues, particularly the Arab issues concerning borders in the Middle East. it would be dangerous. Well, for who in particular was it dangerous? Well, the three top players on the Saudi side were the foreign minister Al-Sakaf, his king, King Fahd, and the oil minister Yamani. And Kissinger worked all of them. All of them were basically of the same opinion on these issues. The ministers were loyal to the king, and that was the opinion that was also, generally held in Saudi Arabia and also many other Arab countries. And they were at the forefront of these Arab concerns. And that was an issue for America. So hints were given, more hints were given. But these three decision makers for Saudi Arabia didn't change. They didn't budge. They were polite, they were friendly, but they kept reiterating this. And they did hint at some stage, well, if nothing happens, then we'll maybe have to stop selling oil, to perhaps the US or other countries. And that wasn't really on. Oil sales should continue, particularly to Europe, Japan, at a higher price, of course. Now, the last was a meeting end of October, beginning of November 1974, where Kissinger was in Riyadh and, met the key people, spoke to the foreign minister again, and again, they reiterated, we want Israel to go back to the borders of 1967. So Kissinger said, well, we'll have to continue our discussions when you come to New York next week. And he did travel to New York to speak at the United Nations. He did speak there. It was his last public speech. He didn't return alive. He died suddenly and unexpectedly in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. His body was sent back to Saudi Arabia in a US official plane, together with the Undersecretary of State. However, his king, Fahd, continued to repeat his demands that America didn't like. I'm sure he received a few more hints, and it looks like he remained steadfast. So what happened was, half a year later, he was also dead. An assassination had happened, a coup that put another prince in power as the king. Now, remember, by that time, the US had already established complete military and security supremacy within Saudi Arabia. So what about that protection, on the basis of which Saudi Arabia entered into these agreements? Well, it looks like the king was not protected. He was assassinated. And one of the other princes was made king, which is, of course, why I suppose it was the British, their father, King Abdul Aziz. He had 45 sons who were legitimate princes, which I think was considered a good thing from the UK and US sides, because, you always have choice. As for the oil minister, Yamani, it looks like he was still a little bit recalcitrant, probably thinking back to his, former king and colleague Al-Sakaf, and he kept making these demands. So now with him, they thought of a more interesting story, and the good news is he survived. And that story is so dramatic, it's almost unbelievable. You think this is a Hollywood script. Read it up in my Substack, rwerner.substack.com. You will see the infamous, notorious terrorist, underworld Secret Service operator Carlos the Jackal making a dramatic appearance. And yes, Minister Yamani being, exposed to a gun to his head and things like that. So it's quite a story. But in the end, he took the hint and he returned to Saudi Arabia from this very strange experience abroad that you'll have to read about. And he continued his work as oil minister for another 11 years and lived to a ripe old age beyond, I think, 90, because he, became much more amenable to the policies of the day. So the conclusion is this. total US control had been established over Saudi Arabia by the mid-1974 year, by June 74. With this agreement, it was formal and official. So there was no need to specify in this agreement that, oil will be sold only against the US dollar. That was the reality, even if you didn't write it, because Americans were actually implementing policies. And also the 80% rule, that 80% had to be reinvested in US treasuries. Today, the Saudi currency remains pegged to the dollar. US troops and security operators remain in Saudi Arabia. So the story that now Saudi Arabia is sort of moving away from the US, yes, doesn't quite ring as true as one might think if you're not aware of the extent of US control over things in Saudi Arabia. So it is more a planned demolition of the current petrodollar. And that's not surprising because the 1970s inflation was the cover to move from the gold dollar to the petrodollar. And the artificial inflation we've had in 21, 22, which was created again just in the 70s, just like in the 70s by the central banks through massive money creation, has been the cover for the move from the petrodollar to the new system, to the new world financial architecture. Read all about it in my Substack, rwerner.substack.com. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this. Please support my work by subscribing. I would appreciate it. Get an annual subscription or become a founder. Then you will be able to join in meetings with me. Thank you very much and see you soon.